In the mid-1980s, Paris had a serial killer who didn't hide in alleys or attack at night. He knocked on doors, and the people who answered never survived. This is Murder on the Map, a series where I retell a true crime story from every country that I've visited. And today, we're in Paris, France. This is the story of Thierry Paulin, the butcher of Montmartre. If you know me or you've seen any videos on my channel, you know that I've been living in Paris since 2019. And one of the things that I love most about living here is experiencing everyday life and immersing myself in the French habits and French culture. From slow mornings in neighborhood cafes to wandering the streets of Paris after dark. And the neighborhood of Montmartre especially has a very unique energy. The cobbled hills, the street artists, the glow of cafes that spill out into the square. It feels very bohemian, alive, and almost timeless. But that's what makes this case so haunting, because in those same streets, in the very heart of Montmartre, people once lived in fear of a man who turned ordinary doorsteps into places of terror. Thierry Paulin was born on November 28, 1963, in Fort-de-France, Martinique, which is a French island located in the Caribbean. He was born to a teenage mother, and his father left soon after he was born, leaving Thierry to be raised mostly by his grandmother, who owned a restaurant but reportedly gave Thierry very little attention or affection. When he was 10 years old, he moved back in with his mother, who had since remarried, and he tried to blend in as best as he could with his new stepbrothers and sisters. But his family life was turbulent. Relatives recalled that his behavior became erratic and violent, often causing him to lash out at other children. Eventually, his mother had enough, and she asked his father to take Thierry away to live in mainland France, a decision that his father accepted, reportedly to avoid paying alimony. Now living in metropolitan France, Thierry faced a new kind of isolation. As a mixed-race student among mostly white peers, Thierry had very few friends. His teachers remembered him as argumentative, socially withdrawn, and frequently disruptive. He performed poorly at school and failed his exams. At 17, Thierry was searching for an escape and some structure in his life. He enlisted early in the French Airborne Logistics Force, and for a while, the military gave him something that he had never had before: discipline, routine, and an identity. But it didn't last. By 1984, after leaving the army, Thierry had discovered that his mother had moved to mainland France and was now living in Nanterre, a suburb in the west of Paris. He tried living with her again, but the relationship was hostile, full of tension and resentment. Once in Paris, Thierry reinvented himself in the city's nightlife scene. Charismatic, stylish, and flamboyant, Thierry loved the attention. He became a waiter at Paradis, which is a famous cabaret in Paris known for its drag shows. And before long, he began performing there too, appearing in full drag and singing songs by his idol, Eartha Kitt. Patrons remembered him as magnetic on stage, a young man who craved the spotlight. But when his mother came to see him perform, she left only seconds into the act, unable to accept the life that he was choosing. By his early 20s, Thierry was openly gay, which was unusual at the time, and he was fully immersed in Paris's gay club and drug scene. Friends said that he lived extravagantly and had a taste for champagne, designer clothes, and endless nights in exclusive clubs. Money slipped through his fingers, and when it ran out, he was always looking for the fastest, easiest way to get more. The most important event that happened to Thierry while working at Paradis is that he met Jean-Thierry Mathurin. Jean-Thierry was a 19-year-old who was born in French Guiana but was living in Paris, and he was a drug addict. At this time, Thierry Paulin was also addicted to drugs himself, but a little less severely than the 19-year-old he had met. Thierry quickly fell in love with him and soon became his lover and partner in crime. The two were inseparable, bound by attraction, addiction, and ambition. Together, they fueled their late nights with drugs, shopping, and luxury they couldn't afford. By 1984, Thierry Paulin had run out of patience with ordinary hustles. Petty theft and nightlife jobs just weren't enough to sustain the lifestyle that he craved. And so he turned to a darker solution, one that would make him one of the most notorious killers in French history. The first killings came in October 1984. Two elderly women were attacked on the same night. 91-year-old Germaine Petitot survived her ordeal, but 83-year-old Anna Barbier was smothered with a pillow in her own apartment. When police searched her home, they found it ransacked and discovered that Paulin had taken only 300 francs, which is the equivalent to less than $50. It was a small reward for such staggering brutality, and that night set the tone for what was to come. In the weeks that followed, more and more women were attacked across Montmartre and nearby neighborhoods in northern Paris, and Thierry Paulin's methods were as varied as they were cruel. Some were asphyxiated with scarves or telephone cords. Others suffocated under plastic bags pulled tightly around their heads. One woman was beaten so badly that neighbors thought she had suffered a fall. Another was forced to drink drain cleaner, her final moments marked by unimaginable pain. His victims were always the same kind of target: elderly women, often widows, often in their 80s and 90s. Many lived alone in modest apartments, tucked into aging buildings with thin doors and no security. They were trusting, isolated, and defenseless. At first, police didn't recognize a pattern. Each crime was logged as an isolated tragedy: a burglary gone wrong, an accidental fall, or simply an old woman dying at home. Bruises were explained away as household mishaps. Strangulation marks were overlooked or misinterpreted. Investigators failed to connect the dots, and the killer moved freely. But as the bodies mounted, the similarities became impossible to ignore. The ransacked apartments, the signs of violence, the sheer number of elderly women dying in suspiciously similar ways. This wasn't coincidence. This was a pattern, and behind that pattern was one man. By late 1985, the press had seized on the story. Headlines screamed from the newsstands at every Parisian kiosk. The papers called him the Monster of Montmartre, the Old Lady Killer, and the Grim Reaper of Paris. The names stuck, and with them came a wave of growing fear. For elderly women in Paris, life changed overnight. Many stopped answering their doors entirely. Families begged their mothers and grandmothers to move into safer housing. Community groups handed out whistles and personal alarms. Some elderly residents even barricaded themselves inside their apartments, living in constant fear that the next knock on their door could be their last. But Thierry Paulin was undeterred. For him, these women were easy prey. They had little protection, few visitors, and lives that went largely unnoticed by the outside world. He saw their trust as a weakness to exploit, their solitude as an opportunity. Each robbery funded another night of champagne, cocaine, and designer clothes. By the mid-1980s, at least a dozen women were dead, and Montmartre, once known for its artists, cafes, and winding streets, had become a neighborhood living under the shadow of a predator. The city knew there was a killer, but no one knew his name, where he'd strike next, or how to stop him. By 1986, Thierry's violence was escalating. That year, he learned that he was HIV positive. At the time, there was no treatment, no hope for slowing the illness. Friends later said that the diagnosis had darkened him, that he seemed to believe that his life was already ending. Investigators would later describe the murders that followed as a frenzy, a man racing against death itself, leaving a trail of bodies behind before his own time ran out. In the fall of 1986, Thierry's volatility had finally boiled over. During a dispute with one of his cocaine dealers, Thierry Paulin beat the man with a baseball bat. The dealer reported him, and Thierry was briefly jailed for assault. But it was only a pause. Once he was released, the killings continued. On November 25, 1987, Thierry struck again. He murdered Rachel Cohen, a 79-year-old woman, then attacked Berthe Finelteri, age 87. He suffocated her and left her for dead in her own home. But unlike his other victims, Finelteri survived, and just 2 days later, Thierry killed Geneviève Guermont, adding yet another name to his long list of victims. Finelteri's survival changed everything. Though she was shaken and weak, she was able to give police a detailed description. She said her attacker was a young, mixed-race man, wearing an earring in his left ear. His hair, she remembered, resembled that of the famous sprinter Carl Lewis. She even recalled the sound of his voice, calm, almost gentle, as though he were having a polite conversation, even while he tried to kill her. That description burned into investigators' minds, and within just days, it paid off. On December 1st, 1987, Inspector Francis Jacob spotted a man who fit the description: confident, well-dressed, with the same distinctive hairstyle and earring in his left ear. The man was Thierry Paulin. Jacob moved in quickly, and the killer, who had terrorized Paris for years, was finally under arrest. What followed was almost as chilling as the crimes themselves. In custody, Thierry Paulin cracked within 48 hours. He confessed to killing 21 women, detailing how he selected his victims and the methods he used. Investigators were stunned by his tone, casual, almost indifferent, as if he were recounting nights out at the club rather than actual murders. He admitted that killing gave him a sense of power, a thrill that went beyond money or survival. Ultimately, police attributed 18 to 21 murders to him, though some investigators believe that the true number may have been even higher. His partner, Jean-Thierry Mathurin, was arrested as well. While he was suspected in assisting with some of the robberies, police concluded that the killings themselves had been carried out by Thierry Paulin alone. When Thierry Paulin was arrested, he was just 24 years old, but his body was already betraying him. The man who had stalked the streets of Montmartre with such confidence and charisma was now visibly ill. In custody, his condition worsened rapidly. Diagnosed with AIDS at a time where there was no treatment, he soon developed tuberculosis and meningitis. The illnesses ravaged him. Within months, the once flamboyant nightclub regular was nearly paralyzed, unable to walk unassisted. Doctors examined him and declared him unfit to stand trial, and with that decision, the possibility of any public reckoning disappeared. There would be no courtroom where victims' families could face him, no judge to read out the charges, no sentence to mark the scale of his crimes. After years of being terrified by his presence, Paris would never see justice carried out. On the night of April 16, 1989, at just 25 years old, Thierry Paulin died in the hospital wing of Fresnes prison. For some, it felt like karma, the killer claimed by the disease before the state could punish him. But for many of the victims' families, it was just another wound. He had escaped formal judgment, his crimes never measured in a trial, his name never condemned by a verdict. His partner, Jean-Thierry Mathurin, faced his own trial. He was convicted for his role in the earlier robberies and attacks, and was sentenced to life in prison plus 18 years without parole. Yet, decades later, in 2009, Jean-Thierry Mathurin walked free. For families who had already endured the loss of mothers and grandmothers, this release felt like another betrayal, a justice system that was too quick to forget the scale of the horror. For the survivors, the closure never came. They had watched their loved ones die in brutal, senseless ways. Women suffocated in their own homes, possessions stolen, lives extinguished for money that often vanished in just a single night of champagne and cocaine. And then they had to watch as the killer himself slipped away from any and all accountability, protected by illness rather than condemned by law. In France, this case forced painful conversations. It revealed how vulnerable elderly women were, especially those living in aging apartments with little to no security. It showed how society often overlooked them, how the police dismissed bruises as falls, sudden deaths as natural causes, and never saw the pattern until it was too late. Some officers later admitted what families had long suspected, that if the victims had been younger, wealthier, or more influential, the investigation would have likely been taken more seriously, and perhaps lives could have been saved. In Montmartre, the memory of Thierry Paulin lingered long after his death, not only as the Butcher of Montmartre or the Grim Reaper of Paris, but as a symbol of how violence can hide in plain sight, and how justice, sometimes, never comes at all. Today, the story of Thierry Paulin is remembered not just for the horror of his crimes, but for how long they went on in plain sight. A man who turned kindness into weakness, who exploited trust, age, and vulnerability, and a man who reminded a city that true horror doesn't always lurk in the shadows, but sometimes it knocks on your front door. This is Murder on the Map, and this was the story of Thierry Paulin, the Butcher of Montmartre.